So welcome, friends. My name is Jeremy Rutledge. I'm the senior pastor at Circular Congregational Church in Charleston, South Carolina, and it is my delight to welcome you to our fall lectures in theology and ethics with the Reverend Dr. Serene Jones. As we begin, I would like to thank all who have worked so hard to make this evening possible, particularly Catherine Cullinan and Ted Morrow in Charleston, and Virginia Fisher and Thomas Arbuckle in New York. I'd like to thank the congregation at Circular Church for its embrace of theological and ethical study as complements to our life together and our work for justice in the world. I'd like to thank the Circular Church Endowment Board for its generous support of these lectures, bringing the finest scholars in the country to Charleston and making them free and available to all. And I'd like to thank each of you for joining us in this time together. At Circular Church, we say every Sunday that whoever you are and wherever you are on life's journey, you are welcome in our community. We welcome friends of every race and ethnicity, every sexual orientation and gender identity, every age and life experience, every faith and philosophy to this gathering. Every person here brings the wisdom of your life experience, and we are all the richer for it. So welcome, friends. We are really glad that you're here. This evening and tomorrow morning, we'll move quickly at just over an hour for each session. The Reverend Dr. Jones will present for approximately half an hour. Then she and I will begin a conversation, and then we'll move to questions from the larger group. We'll conclude around 8:15, maybe 8:25, since we started a little late. If you have a question, I'd invite you to please enter it into the chat at any time. I'll do my best to move through those questions and get to as many as possible. Thanks in advance for your patience and also for your questions, which will shape part of our time together. And with that, let me introduce our distinguished guest. I'm delighted to introduce the Reverend Dr. Serene Jones. Dr. Jones is the president of the Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York and Johnston Family Professor for Religion and Democracy. Before serving at Union, Dr. Jones taught theology at Yale Divinity School and women's, gender, and sexuality studies at Yale University. She is also a past president of the American Academy of Religion. Her books include Call It Grace, Finding Meaning in a Fractured World, Trauma and Grace, Theology and a Ruptured World, Autobiographies of Grace. Yet what stands out about Dr. Jones isn't her extraordinary theological career. It's the power of her voice. She offers a public, progressive theology that speaks truthfully to each of us and our times. And Call It Grace, she draws on everything from the prairie of her the treatises of John Calvin to the songs of Woody Guthrie and the questions with which she struggles to this day. She also includes trauma in the story, her trauma, our individual traumas, and our shared trauma as a nation, as a way of telling the whole story, not simply the parts we'd like to tell. To see ourselves for what we really are, she writes, is the first and hardest theological lesson of all. Friends, tonight I am so grateful we have a theologian to help us see ourselves as we really are, which may just be the way of seeing our path forward. Will you join me in welcoming virtually to Charleston, the Reverend Dr. Serene Jones? We're so glad you're with us.
Well, thank you. And thank you for that nice introduction. Reverend Rutledge, Jeremy, it's wonderful to be with your congregation this evening. I love it when I'm able to see the faces of people sitting in a sanctuary or a church hall or an auditorium somewhere. So this evening, I get to imagine that you're smiling throughout. So that's a pleasure for me. I hope you're smiling throughout. And I do look forward to the day when we can all begin to gather together again. I bring you greetings from Union Theological Seminary. Um, we are just in our third week of the new semester, and we were closed last year, as many schools across the country were, but we decided to reopen this fall. So we have a full cohort of students and faculty on campus, and our courses are being taught in person. And we had a vaccine mandate, so we're 100% vaccinated, which is really quite miraculous, with no real resistance to it at all. And we're also still wearing masks and practicing comfortable social distancing whenever we're in public places or classrooms together. So I just like to share with people, well, what we're doing as we respond to this, because I think every community is struggling in its own way to figure out what it means to find the models of response that work best. And we began our whole semester by having all different parts of the community sign a covenant. And the covenant was centered around the theological notion of taking care. And that the most important way in which we agreed through this covenant to move forward through this phase of the pandemic was to do so in such a way that we were able to take care of each other by respecting the really wide range of places that people are with respect to their health in terms of the pandemic, their family's health, their children, people that they work with, and we have within Union very, very many diversities of all sorts, and to try to begin to see that diversity also with respect to how you adjust your life in this particular moment in time is a whole new way of thinking about diversity, but also a whole new way about thinking about what it means to embrace our neighbors. So we don't have a one size fit all, except when it comes to getting the vaccine, and that was mandated, and the masks are mandated. But we have a very open and embracing, hopefully successfully unfolded way of dealing with each other as we move forward. Hopefully, I would say, a very graceful way of moving forward, and how one finds grace in the midst of all of the struggles that our world encounters today is a huge question. As Jeremy mentioned, I just finished a book before the pandemic entitled Call It Grace. It's a book that I was charged to write to explain complicated theological concepts by using, short stories from my own life. And it was a book that when I sat down to try to do that very simple task, I found myself unable to disentangle stories from my own life from my own grappling with and wrestling with the deepest and truest theological claims that shape my life and have been throughout my life articulated to me by various theologians. This past week, what I thought I would do this evening, and we can come back tomorrow and talk more because I think it's very helpful about the notion of understanding this very and human agency and human freedom, and human determinism, the destinies that we're given. But tonight I want to talk a little bit about a larger framework. Um, I was watching, I think now maybe probably 10 days ago, television with my 26-year-old daughter, who always introduces me to channels that I didn't know existed. And we stumbled upon a video of Jeff Bezos's new robot. I don't know if you have seen the YouTube video of this robot, but the robot is shaped like a person. It's actually shaped like a tall, very perfectly in shaped man, and probably shaped like Jeff Bezos. And it's equipped to do anything that you could possibly want it to do around your house or in your life. And after that, we pursued this conversation in which the just came with crystal clarity to me that it's so fascinating and such a huge paradox that as a human species that we have managed in our evolution to reach a point in time where we can, in fact, have robots that do all of the activities that we do that are mechanical or task oriented. We know with AI, with artificial intelligence, even now having machines that can do complex thinking, that reflects the way in which the human mind works. We live in a moment in which, yes, we have a global pandemic that is lives too numerous to even imagine. And at the same time, we have science that is coming up in a very condensed period of time with a vaccine that may not protect us completely, but at least allows the possibility of ongoing life in so many communities, particularly communities at high risk. So we've made all these advances in technology. But when it comes to the technologies of the human soul, like when it comes to the work, the labor of being a human being, of understanding what the meaning of your life is, what we're all called to do and be here on this earth, how to love, how to have compassion, what it means to be vulnerable. How do we understand our interconnectedness? How do we wrestle with the fact that we are born and we die? How to come to grips with the fragility and yet the resilience of our identities, and how to wrestle with that complex truth that we are both, each of us, very unique individuals, and yet we're also never able to separate who we are from the communities and the environments and the world in which we're located. And that world does not just stop where our skin begins, but we are actually part of the world in which we live. It becomes the space of who we are. These complex realities of what I call soulcraft, or the of a human consciousness, has evolved so very little, has evolved so very little. When you look at the political conflicts and divides that are pulling our nation apart, when you watch the videos of what's happening on the border right now, which has been happening for a long time with South American and Central American immigration, and most recently with Haitian refugees. When you look at the last days of the US occupation of Afghanistan and what that 20-year war consisted of, And then when you turn around in the midst of all of that and wrestle with what does it mean that hurricane after hurricane uh, comes up upon our shores? They come up upon your shores, and then probably about 12 hours later, they always come up right upon our shores up here in New York. But what that says to us about the speed with which what we always imagined would be somewhere in the distance of 30 to 50 years, the impact of climate change is upon us now. As we have these major questions, major issues, major conflicts that have to do with our ability to engage them in the future of the species and the future of our planet, we seem to be pretty bad at it. In fact, you would never believe that when it comes to the work of love or of peacemaking, we seem to have been stuck somewhere back, and this is not to speak bad of the Neanderthals, but somewhere back in the Neanderthal period, where when it comes to technology, we can push buttons and have robots clean our houses. How do we manage that enormous disconnect? I was talking yesterday with a friend of mine who is a major philanthropist in New York, particularly about homelessness in New York. And we were talking about the statistics, the degree to which homelessness is increasing under the pressures of the pandemic, how the really escalating violent tactics of the NYPD are exacerbating the issues of homelessness and the great need we have for a very comprehensive approach to it. But he made the point that you could take $10 billion and you could drop it right on top of the issue, something as specific as homelessness in New York City. And if we haven't done the work of soulcraft, if we haven't done the work of having the will to address homelessness, if we haven't done the hard work of deciding at a spiritual level that homelessness is no longer tolerable, and that it is something that that must be engaged so that all people can flourish, within less than a year, that $1 billion would be gone and the problems of homelessness would still be there. So addressing the issues of what I call soulcraft is not just a sort of side issue that we need to attend to as we watch technologies move ahead and as we watch governments wrestle with the distribution of funds, which of course is absolutely critical for our collective life together. But issues of soulcraft have to do with the deep stories we tell ourselves about the meaning. And most importantly, nestled in the middle of that is a set of deep claims about what we think is true about human beings. I'm afraid that one of the most basic claims, claim that I grew up in a church that never questioned the fundamental bedrock character of this claim. The Constitution of the United States struggles every day to better and better embrace this claim because of its own failures from the start. But this fundamental Christian claim, humanistic claim as well, about the quality of every human being is a spiritual claim that cannot be taken for granted. And how do we in this nation, and I'm asking this as a serious question, not one to which I have an answer, begin to have political discussions at that level? And if our churches and our many religious communities and our communities of ethics and conscience are not up for that conversation, then how is that conversation going to happen? And how do we move forward with the question about these, for me, deep-seated conviction that whatever you say about the truth of reality, when you look around you, when seeing from the perspective of God, all creatures bear equally God's likeness, and in that sense, share equally in the grace of God and are equally deserving of the conditions of flourishing which God grants us on this amazing earth on which we live. So theology really is nothing but the deep stories we tell ourselves, nestled within it, this big question about the character. Oh, I'm not speaking loudly enough. Is this better? Let's see, I just saw a chat, so thank you for that. Is this better? Can you hear me better now? Is that better, Jeremy?
Like, yes, it says better.
Okay, good, better. All right, thank you. So I find myself at times as a theologian who's now taught theology for over almost 40 years and have taught people the history of doctrine and the ways in which belief systems are put together and what does it mean to situate yourself within the Christian community and even more specifically within the Protestant Christian community, and even more specifically, what does it mean to find yourself shaped by the beliefs and practices of a progressive Protestant Christian lineage? What are the fundamental orienting stories and claims that shape you? I find myself recently often at a loss for words as to how it is we move forward. I know we must move forward together, and I know we must move forward with a kind of bold determination, not a lack of conviction, but strong conviction. And yet there is a kind of open-heartedness that is going to be required of us that progressives are not so good at learning what it means to exercise those muscles of openness when it comes to people whose political convictions and theological convictions you so disagree with. But I also think underneath it all, it's going to come down to a profound understanding of all of those deep questions that as a community across our religious and political divides, are questions that we can't answer and mysteries to which we do not and cannot claim to have solved all of the issues. And what does it mean to together to step into that space of exploration? I wanted to share with you a quote. I have been this semester, as I've been trying to find my way back to the crafts of the soul craft. I've been doing a lot of reading of a theologian who, in my younger life, I didn't read a lot, but who most recently has become important to me. He's a theologian who spent a lot of time at Union Theological Seminary, and his name is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I'm sure many of you know of Bonhoeffer. But he has this quote in his letters and papers from prison that he could have written yesterday. Mm. And this is where I find myself. We have been silent witnesses of so many evil deeds. We have been drenched by so many unstoppable storms. We have learned well in all of their political forms, the arts of equivocation and ongoing pretense to knowledge.
Mm.
Experience, I'll ad lib here, experience every day on the street has made us suspicious of one another and has kept us from being, in our suspicions, truthful and open. And then he says, intolerable conflicts have just worn us down, and as a result, made us cynical. And then he asks a very difficult question directly to us. Are we still of any use? Are we still of any use? And he asks us that as church, as Christians, as believers, as those gathered here this evening, as those in this nation. And then he makes this observation. What we need going forward are not geniuses or more cynics or misanthropes or clever tacticians or great artists or brilliant songwriters. What we need are plain, honest, straightforward people. Plain, honest, straightforward people. And then he asks a question. Will our inward power of resistance be strong enough? And will our honesty with ourselves, our own self-interrogation, be remorseless enough for us to find our way back to that straightforwardness and simplicity? So I conclude this lecture part of what is a much fuller evening than just my reflections with this, because I think what Bonhoeffer reminds me of is, as I read it in terms of an indictment of my own self, is how easy it is when it comes to knowledge and the politics of moving forward and the work of the church, how easy it is for us to think that things are so complex that it's complicated for us to find that path forward. And we seem to think, we seem to think we need geniuses, or we're waiting for some superstar to descend that will lead us forward. But he goes in the absolute opposite direction. He says, that's not what we need. We need you and you and you. Straightforward, simple, honest, not cynical, not arrogant, not entitled, not impatient, but straightforward, honest people. Are we going to be remorseless enough with our own selves? And are we going to be hopeful enough in our communities to walk that road? So I'm going to stop there for now, and Jeremy, and open it to our conversation with each other.
Yeah, thank you. It really does strike me, Serene, that sounded like, you were reading an op-ed from this morning's newspaper.
My goodness, I know.
And one of my questions, just as you were reading it, was about how you think our inability to tell the full truth about ourselves might play into the sectarian divide or the increase there. And when I say us, I mean the us that are on this call, the us that are in this room, including myself. But I wonder, I was really struck by the truth telling in Call It Grace. And I think this is a bad paraphrase, forgive me, but I think at one point you said, if we don't tell the whole story, we're kidding ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
and it's an illusion essentially. And so I just wondered if you had a thought on truth telling and and that deepening divide, and what it's not coming out as a fully formed question.
No, that's a great question though, because so much of what we're wrestling with in this country, and what sits at the heart of the soul craft that I'm talking about, is the ability to find that simple kind of truth telling. And we see this right now with this ludicrous debate over critical race theory, where it's not just being supported by the religious right. I mean, this is what's so difficult about this moment in time in our country. As a religious person, is the right-wing agenda is being driven by religious people. It's not just being supported, but it's now being driven by them. And so this nonsense about stopping the teaching of critical race theory is just one example of a whole set of political machinations designed to stop the simplest and most obvious truths about our nation from being spoken about. I mean, the over 300, now almost 400 years of chattel slavery and Jim Crow in its original form and its new forms, those aren't complex things to see. That is, they are. It is takes a lot of personal, remorseless interrogation of oneself and one's history to come to grips with those, but they're not deeply. They're not buried in some. The truth of them is not buried in some cave out in a desert, down in the middle of the quickly shrinking Antarctica. It's right there in front of us as the history that is the true history of this nation. I had a piece that came out in Time magazine this week, where I simply wrote about the fact that, critical race theory is simply asking us to think about the ways in which the construction of racial identity in our country has impacted how we perceive reality. And that means looking at the history of white supremacy and racism in our country, which is it's not a very big and heavy claim to make. And I said, if you want to ban critical race theory, then you have to really think seriously about banning the. In the Hebrew scriptures is a story about an enslaved people, their enslavers, and what it means to go through a process of seeking liberation, and the very long process of which that is, and the presence of God on the side of the enslaved as that liberation is thought. So are we ready to now start banning our Bibles too, with respect to what it means to be telling the truth about our history? And I think that's one of the things that biblical study students, when they come to seminary, many of them are reading the full Bible for the first time, find so interesting about it is that in scripture itself, there is no, in the Hebrew scriptures in particular, the history of the Hebrew people into one nice little sweet story of upward mobility. I mean, this is a story of wars and of families falling apart and peoples being enslaved and nations making huge mistakes. And it is not a eyes and but it is a history that is read in tooth and claw. It's so hard to tell the truth. I think the simple answer to that is that the legacy of slavery and a Native American genocide in this country, that somehow as white people, and we've been taught this, it's been like embedded in our bones. We're just as constructed as everybody else. That if we tell the truth about that, somehow we're going to die. Like somehow it's just going to fell us, how could we possibly tell something that horrible and admit to it, because we're just going to implode. And the truth of the matter is that once you start talking about that history and digging into your own family stories and finding it, like I did in my own work, you discover quite fast that you don't just keel over and die. You don't actually implode. You don't even implode emotionally. You actually find the liberating power of the truth and connections that it takes for us to move forward. That's a very long answer. I'm sorry I went on about it, but it's
No,
important question for right now in our
yeah,
day.
it's a vital answer. And it just strikes me that we're also really talking about trauma, that we don't, the Bible doesn't conceal its trauma.
No.
Those stories they're traumatic, they're difficult, and for a lot, they were horrifying, in places. But the trauma was never concealed. And I think it's really interesting, Serene, to live in a place like Charleston that only, the story of trauma is embedded here. It's, if the Stones could cry out, the things they would say in Charleston, which made itself, from the selling of beings. That's what happened here. That's what made this city and this place. And then we are known, or like to think we are known for our civility and our politeness, all these contradictions. So we tell one story about ourselves all too often, but there's extraordinary trauma here. But without going on too much about that, I just think we avoid telling stories that are traumatic, and maybe in that avoidance we can't ever get anywhere. And what I felt like you were doing so well, and call it grace, or embodying or inviting us to do, was just telling the truth, which again is not, on the one hand, is not difficult, but on the other hand, I think is something we're not well practiced at.
Yeah, we're not. Yeah, and we're terrified of it. It's one of those things like, you're terrified the first time you get up to bat in a softball game as a little kid, and then you swing the bat and you realize there's nothing to be afraid of here. In fact, this I don't mean to simplify it, that telling the truth about the horrors of our history is like playing a game. I'm saying it's more like that experience of realizing that thing that you're terrified of, you have been taught to be terrified of it, because there is a lot to be gained by your silence. And the whole system was dependent upon the complicity of white people, and the silence of white people. And what we too often miss when we talk about, particularly when it comes to chattel slavery and Native American genocide, is at the very same time Africans were being enslaved and brought to this nation and constructed and pressed into beings who provided all of the labor as if for the wealth that our country was built on. So too, at the same time, that same machine was taking all of the as James Baldwin puts it, the Norwegians, the Swedes, the Welsh, the Irish, who were down there in the same area, and turning them into white people, because they needed to become white people who were capable of torturing other bodies that were Black. They needed to become capable of inflicting enormous cruelty on other human beings. And they needed to become capable of not seeing it. They needed to be taught how not to see the horror of what was happening. And when we talk about white supremacy, too seldom do white people talk about the process by which whiteness itself was constructed and is traumatic. The reason it's traumatic to try to talk about whiteness is white people have been traumatized into thinking that it is traumatic. And that's part of the trick of the whole system of the setup of race in this country.
Right, absolutely. And it's, I feel like we see it playing out every day, these traumas that are inherited. And so I'm also glancing over, because we're beginning to get some questions. So I want to invite others into the conversation as well. And Serene, the first question from Fu, who is a dear friend from Houston and a theologian as well. He asks, what is the relationship between grace and justice? Often when grace is used to cover up acts of injustice, how can grace be embodied in a way to produce justice, especially restorative justice, rather than enable and perpetuate injustice?
Mm-hmm. So it's a great question. And it's, I mean, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, just to jump back to my previous quote, is really famous for using the term cheap grace to talk about any understanding that if in a Christian context we understand grace as the unmerited and all-encompassing and infinite love of God that embraces all of us, irrespective of who we are and what we do with our lives. One of the worries that someone like Bonhoeffer or theologians have had throughout time is that, well, if God's love is that big and that universal, then why do we have to behave if we're going to get that grace anyway? So why not just sin a lot and sin boldly and do all sorts of injustice and use grace as the cover? The first response to that is that if grace, if one's beloved character before God leads one to pursue a life of injustice or to sin boldly, then one hasn't really grasped the reality of that grace, because it becomes impossible when one is captured by the reality of grace to absolutely discard the value of all of the other graced human beings and graced environment and ecology in which we find ourselves. But the second thing, this is a much more practical response. That was a sort of doctrinal response. So we had our opening convocation at Union last week, and Cornel West spoke. And he began by talking about, because he knows Union very well, he began by talking about how, Union is so well known for being a social justice seminary, and how we have a long history of being on the cutting edge of all the social justice issues that are, that our world is wrestling with. And he said, we are on that justice train. And then he stopped dead in his tracks and he looked at everybody and he said, but brothers and sisters, let me tell you, got to get on the love train before you can get on the justice train, or you're not going to be able to stay on that justice train very long. And you might even hurt some people while you're on it. And he just sort of did, his whole talk was this unpacking of the relationship between love or grace and justice. And it's to say that if our justice making is not grounded fundamentally out of profound compassion for the deeply interconnected and radically equal character of our human existence in our complex ecology, if it called it in that spirituality of the soul as it's, then the work of justice to try to look at how and do the work tending especially to those on the underside and the most vulnerable among us. That work comes as a response to the overabundance of love that is what we call grace. So the two are intimately tied together. And I think if you don't pursue of justice, once you come to know the radical reality of love, then you really don't know the radical reality of love, because injustice then becomes intolerable to you. Is that an adequate answer? I'm sure you, as a theologian, already have an answer to that question too.
Feel free to chime in again if you want to. And Serene, when you call the name of Cornel West too, I just hear the soundtrack of Curtis Mayfield singing "Love for the People," and that the idea that that's good for the soul, that's the starting place. And in some ways, I think it's a segue to Paul Palmer's question: where does the listening fit in, or where does listening fit into the plain truth telling in a loving manner with others with whom we disagree? And this may not be a surprise to you or others on this call. Our congregation is a progressive congregation in a very conservative political climate in South Carolina, and we're not having a shortage of people with whom we disagree. And so, and sometimes dangerously so during COVID times and other, with some of the Proud Boys demonstrations we've seen in Charleston with other things. These are dangerous disagreements we're having, and vital disagreements. I think about the nature of democracy and our commitments to each other. But sorry, that was a little bit too much context perhaps, but where does the love fit in to listening, trying to listen deeply to those with whom we disagree? Even if I'm inserting some of this, even if we're really engaged in a struggle with them.
Yeah. I mean, so, to be honest, we are engaged in a struggle, and it is, it's not a gentle struggle. It's a fierce battle, and it is one that requires an enormous amount of courage and determination and fortitude of spirit. But if one, in entering into this struggle, which is just an all-out struggle for hearts and minds in the future of this nation, if you don't go into it grounded in love for the people with whom you are, let's just use the image of doing battle, not necessarily physical battle, but at times, sadly, it is physical battle, but doing ideological battle with. If you don't have a fundamental love for them, then you are either going to undermine your own best position by your inability to think most clearly about what needs to happen, and you're going to burn out way before the struggle even gets out of the starting gate. That task of learning how to love the people that are spitting at you is, talk about the technologies of soul, talk about soulcraft. I mean, talk about practices deep inside ourselves that have to be cultivated for us to be able to do that. We know how important that was in the civil rights movement, but across the nation, in so many places, we seem to have lost touch with that as a very central part of what it means to be engaged in a case of a Christian community, as Christians in this struggle. And I find listening is a critical part of that. And I don't mean always listening. I mean, it's very hard to listen when you're being shouted at and you're being demeaned. And there's often times when you have to remain a loving presence, but you have to sort of close off your ears so you can't hear it because it's too overwhelming and it's too damaging of your spirit to hear that much hatred come towards you. I think there's other forms of listening that um, that we can engage in that aren't so much about listening to the obvious words that are shared by those you or I might oppose, but listening with our hearts to the realities out of which this level of anger and rage and sense of distrust and disenfranchisement is coming. Where that lives and why it's been reignited, or was it ever not ignited? Why is it suddenly surfacing as a fire that's been burning for a long time? And what is at stake? What is at stake for those with whom you're able to articulate in your own case what's at stake for you, but are you able to understand truly what's at stake for them in a way that's not, as the Bonhoeffer quote says, in a way that's not cynical about who they are, and in a way that's not, someone said to me the other day, and I think this is really true, most progressive people truly think that people who are conservative or religious right-wingers are really not smart and really not well put together, or think they're stupid, they think very condescendingly about who they are as human beings. Until we come to grips with that dynamic that's so deeply embedded in this nation and feeds this vicious cycle we're in, it's going to be harder to disrupt it. And I think it is true as to how progressives think about the religious right. The religious progressives think of the religious right in very personally derogatory terms with respect to your understanding of their integrity as people.
Right. I'm sure that's one of our sins in the progressive community, religion. And I think along with a certain lack of curiosity,
Yeah, that's good.
to really know and understand and listen and to be genuinely curious about those who are very different. And I'll confess, I mean, that's difficult to do when the struggle is real and when it's dangerous. So there's a genuine struggle for me. For example, I'm immunocompromised, and I am curious to know why people would not become vaccinated or wear a mask. I'm also afraid of them because I have lung disease, and that's a great threat to I'm very high risk. So, but how to not be governed by the fear or by the difference or by those divides. I think hopefully our faith would not only ask, but really demand a little more of us, which doesn't mean that we don't need to be in a struggle. I would go right back and stand next to you in Cornell West and say we could love the people and we could struggle. And I'll always love him for calling people his brother or sister or his family member in the middle of the struggle, in the middle of the argument, because that's such a beautiful theological he sort of recommits himself to that in the middle of an argument. So anyway, here I'm just.
It doesn't. In order to listen deeply and be curious and to engage the struggle, means you have to love yourself as much too, and that's also sometimes what people who have been socialized on the margins are not taught to be caregiving enough to themselves. Actually, across the board in this nation, we're not taught actually what it means to take care of yourself. But all of those things that you're saying about learning to love the other need to apply to your own self as well. So that you can be around, all of us can be around for the continued struggle.
Right. And to borrow from the mystics and the good therapists, our true self, not our ego, which is a big mess.
Our true self.
If we can.
That simple self that Bonhoeffer is referring to, that simple self that we need to get back to, which is not nearly as complicated as our traumas have taught, as our traumas have taught us to believe that it is.
And maybe the longer we don't deal with our trauma, the more we can kind of reinforce that. If we don't go near it, then we'll just remain convinced that it's too complex to go near. And Bill Epps has asked a question too. He's just begun, call it grace. He loves the image of your grandmother Idabel and the cool steel water container. That really was such a wonderful image. Oh, hang on, it just moved on me. Could you elaborate? Bill asks, the Universalist Prairie Theology of your people and how the concept of original sin survived. Full disclosure, he is a religious naturalist and a Unitarian Universalist who struggles with the idea of sin and refuses the idea of inherited or original sin, but still learning about it, and would love to hear your thoughts.
That is a great question, and that is that's a big question. There's a bunch of questions in there. So to unpack prairie theology and disciples theology and the understanding of original sin. So let's come back to original sin tomorrow morning, because I think there's a lot to be said about that. But I open Call It Grace by trying to describe, first of all, what I call prairie theology, which was the theology that I was taught from the time I could speak. My great-grandparents were Sooners who settled. They were homesteaders in Oklahoma at the turn of the century. And my grandmother grew up in a sod house out in the plains around Billings, Oklahoma. They had to really do this very difficult work of turning concrete hard prairie into arable soil to raise wheat, which they were eventually able to do. But the prairie theology, I gave a lecture earlier this week about the sort of key features of prairie theology, and it's as it's emerged, it's different from the way I outline it in the book, but it is this fundamental belief in the grace of God, which manifests itself in a profound sense of the interconnectedness of everyone. So for my great-grandparents there on the prairie, you were physically and realistically intertwined with the fate of everyone around you. And if you all did not stick together in the face of disease, famine, storms, failed crops, the death of a parent and what happens to the kids, you simply wouldn't survive. And that sense of radical interconnectedness, just simply for the sake of existing, was just, bred in here as the core foundation of that prairie theology. And an interesting side note to that is that doesn't mean you actually have to like them. But to know that you're interdependent and that you're responsible for each other is what it requires, which is very different from, having to like the way that they, the way that they make their coffee in the morning or the campfire outside. And then the second, I think, very important belief of this prairie theology is that it's this tension between recognizing that the work of remaking the world, literally on a day-to-day basis, is dependent upon you and your community's labor. Like, your community is going to be what you make it become. There's no intermediary notion that there is some artificial imposition of something called government, which is anything other than what we decide it's supposed to be. So a really very realistic view of civil responsibility and civic creation and engagement. We make the rules that govern our society together are the rules we make up. And to always have to balance that with the forces that are outside of your control. And those so often have to do with hostile forces that you can't control, storms you can't prevent. I'm talking back in terms of my grandparents' prairie existence. We don't ultimately have control over the very character of the bodies that we're born into.
Right.
We have a lot that we can do with these bodies that we're born into, but we don't get to make up the formula before we're born in terms of who we are going to be with respect to how we physically occupy space in this world in which we live. So holding together that utter responsibility for civic reality and a realistic sense of the givenness of so many forces which impinge upon who we are and how we live.
Right. Well, I kind of wonder, as sort of follow-up to that, if you had any thoughts for the group. I think Call It Grace is so rich with your own experience as theological resource. And I wonder if you would have any thoughts for anyone who might be looking back on their own life experience and thinking, maybe most of us did not go get an MDiv, but we might have had an experience like you had with your grandmother. I wonder if, as people are looking back, into their own experiences, do you have any thoughts for them to what to look for, or where they might find those resources?
Well, so whenever I talk about the book Call It Grace, this question comes up, and inevitably a group forms at the church and people start trying to do their own spiritual autobiography, which I think is fantastic. And I didn't know I was going to write a spiritual autobiography, so I am not an expert on spiritual autobiography. In my case, it just kind of accidentally happened that I couldn't do theology without telling my own story, my own experience with it. So I didn't have any lessons in the writing of spiritual autobiography. But I did learn some things along the way. I learned that it's probably the easiest form of writing I've ever done, because you just have to have confidence that your experience is legitimate, and you don't have to get everyone in the world to agree with your experience, and you don't have to footnote your experience. Unlike writing an academic paper where you have to go prove that this is where this note came from history, or this is the exact time this happened. The creative license that you have when you're doing sort of spiritual autobiography, it's yours. It's your story and your experience. Secondly, if you're going to write, go for the juicy stuff. Go for the juicy stuff, and in your own life what that is. Because it's juicy for you, because it's the most formative moments of your own life. Those are usually moments that are about truth telling, about your own gross foibles. My book is filled with a long list of all the mistakes I've made throughout my life. And it's also filled with life and death moments when new insight breaks through or doesn't. But when you're writing about people, because it's hard to tell a story about your own life, if you've been in any kind of community without including other people, I've always had the policy of letting them read what I say about them as I tell their story, if I'm going to make any kind of public use of it, and just as a way of respecting them. And if you're not able to let them read it, then I suggest that you don't write about them. because it's gonna hinder your ability to tell the truth if you're not willing to tell it in the context of of that kind of honesty. Last thing I'll say, this is going to sound so brutal, but I don't think I could have written that book until I was 60, because enough central figures in the book had to leave this earth behind before I was able to talk with honesty about the history in my family of my family's own implication in Jim Crow and in a horrible lynching, and in the denial around the Tulsa Race Massacre, and the list goes on. Sexual abuse in the family, the larger family, not my immediate family. My mother's terrible betrayal of my father. I mean, all those are things I could not have talked about had my mother still been alive, for instance, or my grandfather. It would be much more difficult.
Right. Well, I'm grateful to you for sorry, I got a weird echo. I'm grateful to you for that vulnerability, and I think it invited me to revisit parts of my own story with that same kind of vulnerability. I think it invites any reader to do that, and so it was a gift in that way. I'm giving it short shrift to go to the next question, but it was helped me to powerfully revisit things I haven't really wanted to tell, but needed to tell or to look at. And I hope others in this group, in this conversation, would do the same or feel encouraged to do the same. So Maggie Griffin says, you have been taught to be afraid of it, taught fear of the other, traumatized to believe it. And it's not exactly phrased as a question from Maggie, but certainly a reflection of that. And we have been taught that. And do you have any thoughts on the current? I don't want to be too facile here, but I do think that we're being taught that more and more, that it's getting worse, or at least that seems to be my perspective. How do we unlearn that stuff, or how do we counter it? I wonder.
Yeah, sometimes I wonder if we sit around long enough saying it's getting worse, getting more and more hateful, getting more and more hateful, it actually ends up becoming that way because we've said it long enough that we've actually instilled in our own selves so much fear that we can't leave our living room because we're afraid someone's gonna pull out a gun on the street and shoot us, which sadly does happen. So that's where that line between realistic fear and sort of a fabricated echo chamber fear. And I don't even call realistic fear. I just call it being realistic about the presence of violence in our world. And some fear is always good because there are things in our world that we should be afraid of, and that's how we need to be afraid of predators. And the world is filled with predators. On the other hand, there are many places and people in this world that are not predators, and that do not require our fear. And our fear only feeds in a person who isn't a predator a sense of their own predatorial nature and exacerbates it. So we end up creating predators by imagining them. I also think, and this is just a very personal thing, but I have found, I'm now 62, and I have found that as I've gotten older, I've gotten much less afraid. And maybe that just comes with the years, but I have become increasingly, especially in this political climate and dealing with the climate catastrophes we're facing, I just feel that I don't have time to be afraid. That there's so much better use of my energy than fear. And fear that debilitates is often tied to fear of dying, fear of death.
Okay.
And at some point in your life, through, how did you put it, through your therapist or the wisdom literature, one of those two? What did you say? That was great. Well said. But that you have to come to grips with the reality of your own death and not let fear of dying dominate how you live. As you get older, it gets, at least for some people, it gets easier to come to grips with your dying because it gets closer and you have to deal with it. But I think that fear of death is all pervasive in our society. And yet we're a society of death.
Right. And that seems like another trauma that we don't talk about, and therefore it has a kind of power. We don't talk about our mortality, and haunts us in a different way.
Yeah.
And it's funny what you mentioned. I mean, when I was younger, Serene, I would often go back to William James on the Mountain Pass, his famous description, act for the best, hope for the best, and take what comes, going through the blinding snow. But when I was younger, I thought that's because I would be an adventurer and nothing would happen. I'd take the risk and I'd be okay.
Yeah.
And now that I'm kind of in the middle of life, 50, I read the same words and I think, yeah, risk is required, but I think I might die. You
realize that death is a reality.
Right, but still the risk is required. I don't have certainty that everything will go my way.
You're not in denial about it. Yeah.
Excuse me. So let's see. I'm going to be mindful of our questions too, and also our time. Candace mentions that it's difficult for some people to know the difference between listening with your heart or really with your head or with your thoughts, thinking. And that's a really good observation, Candace, I think. And Candace is an especially compassionate person, Serene, so I think excels at listening with her heart. I don't know if you have a thought on that as well.
Candace probably has a lot of good things to say about that. By the fact she can even ask that question, she knows some wise things to say about it. But I do think listening with your heart, you open up yourself to hear all of those tonalities of being that aren't in the words themselves, but in the way a person occupies space and time. When you listen with your heart, you're able to pick up that. And that tells you much more about a person often than their words. And that's what it means to listen to the heart. All of the information that we're getting that we need in order to expand our capacity for compassion is there in that kind of heart listening. I think that's why Zoom is so exhausting after a while. Like this evening is the perfect amount of time because it's not exhausting. But I remember when the pandemic began and I would get off a day of Zoom calls and be astonished at how tired I was. And it finally hit me that I wasn't. It was because it's very hard to listen with your heart on Zoom because you can't pick up all of this colloquial way to put it, but all the vibes that bodies are putting out as they communicate with one another. All those things that we listen to and the way people hold their hands or place their arm on the desk. I'm sure as we move forward, we're going to find new ways to communicate in forms that embrace that. But Zoom only contains this much of space for heart to listen in.
Right, right. Gosh, that's so true. And Candace, I'm so grateful you asked that question because um, hands down, the single hardest thing for me being a senior pastor during this time is um, I realized immediately how much I learn and take in and know from being with others, from that sort of that way of listening. It's not, it was much more intuitive.
Yeah.
Um, and in many ways much more embodied than I could realize until I would, and maybe for a lot of us than any of us could realize until we were faced with having to be separated. You know,
Yeah.
so
Yeah. I think that the social scientists are now telling us in terms of how the brain and the body works that like 90% of the information we take in at the level of intuition and not direct perception. So it's interesting that, and that's what Zoom makes very much more difficult.
right. And I wonder for churches,
But we also want to be alive and to be thrive and to be together in a healthy way. So
right.
This is where we are.
It is. It's a great challenge for us, but yeah, I just think for churches and other groups, this may be. I'm sure this is true for other groups. It's just really it's really difficult to know how we are without um, the ability to be together in the same way. And we've gone kind of up and down in the ways we can meet Serene based on the virus activity in our community, which has been a very, very high and is now starting to go down. So we're hopeful that we can shift back into, partial in person, partial online, but that's all coming. We're just trying to go with reality. Again, not not fear, but the reality on the ground has been very difficult. And Fu offered some of his thoughts. I might just direct you to them rather than read them to you. And
in the chat, Fu offers his thoughts.
yes, I'm sorry, in the chat.
Okay. Yeah, great comments, Fu. Yes. Yeah, no, absolutely. For those who can read the chat, Fu's comments are very good. I agree.
Yeah, it's the vulnerability piece seems to fit right with the rest of this. And the way we do or don't tell truth, and the way we do or don't hear each other, are present, are able to listen with our hearts, it ties so much together. And I think
it's interesting. I just want to say one thing about that word vulnerability, that it's so interesting that the way we're taught to experience things, that in one community to be truthful about it is to experience yourself being vulnerable, where in another community it would just be being like, that's just what you do. You just, it's just to be human, to be together. And how much even that category of vulnerability is one that's so subject to how it's been constructed over time, because oftentimes feeling vulnerable is attached to feeling fearful, is attached to constructs that have been placed upon us about what we're supposed to be afraid of. So
right is it's I'm also, I don't know exactly how this ties in, and I'm just looking at our time as well, but I loved your description of your friend who took you to yoga for a year, as a way of recovery. And I don't want to give too much away about that experience, but we've talked a lot in our church and more recently about meditation practices, spiritual practices, and that also seems to tie in, at least in terms of healthy understandings of self and ego and fear, and just the ability to stop for a moment and be in just that embodied experience of, it's very difficult to put into words. I think you did it wonderfully in the book, but I've always struggled to talk about why sitting in quiet meditation is such a vital practice.
Yeah.
But I find myself still encouraging people to do that or something like it that nourishes them and that could be a spiritual practice for these times. But these times are just life. So,
and those practices are what I'm talking about at the level of soulcraft. Those are the technologies that will move us forward, the technologies of soul that we need to spend as much time working on as the technologies of our computers and our robots and our AI and our trips to the moon and our it's that technologies of how you move your body in time and space to open up your heart.
Right. And some of us have been driven to the meditation cushion by our computers.
So, true. I know. I wouldn't be able to do mine this past year without my computer.
Well, and I think I want to make sure we have mostly covered everyone or given everyone a chance. Jane Claiborne said something lovely about, the completion of our lives that comes out, or that comes at the end of life and can lessen our fear of death. And oh, a dear friend from Hawaii is here. Hi, Barbara. Barbara was like my big sister growing up. So, but I think, so in terms of embodied practices, in terms of also listening with our hearts and caring for each other, we did structure this. So it would be about an hour and 15 minutes, just knowing that we all have experienced that Zoom fatigue and we wanted the conversation to be good and to move well. And so why don't we think about just kind of wrapping up for the evening, and we can let each other take good care of ourselves. And then we'll be back tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. That's right, isn't it? It's been a long week. So 10 o'clock Eastern, everybody is welcome, and we'll continue this conversation. It'll be a great time to have some coffee and have a Saturday morning in a similar format to this. And I think that's where we are. Serene, it's been so good to spend some time with you this evening. Did you have a final thought for us, or anything a place we might put our minds this evening, or as we think about tomorrow as well?
No, just hope that everyone gets some good night rest tonight. And if in your debriefing after this, you have some insights into particular areas that you're really interested in pushing tomorrow, just shoot me an email and let me know, because I always think that having theological discussions is much, much enriched by talking about something people want to hear talked about. So please let me know, and we can go in that direction. That's what good theology is. So let me know.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
And thanks for joining us. And we will see you in the morning in the same place at 10.
Bye-bye.
All right. Good night.